This car, the way it just rotates around you. Hey everyone, Kurt here with Eat Sleep Drive, and today we're going to be covering what the costs and what it's like to own a Porsche GT car, specifically one like this GT4, because as it turns out, and I sort of alluded to this in my last video, there's some big news. I just sold this car. It's actually no longer mine. The guy wired me the money today, and the only thing I'm supposed to do is make sure that this thing ends up on a car transport heading to New York. So congratulations to the new owner. But what I wanted to do today was talk about how much it cost me to own this thing, some of the costs associated with GT cars, some of the hidden costs, and as well as just the overall experience. We'll take this thing for a drive later, and I'll talk about my experience owning it, daily driving it on occasion, taking it to the canyons. So we'll sum it all up, wrap it up in a bow, and send this car on the way. But first, let's talk about how much it costs to own this car. It only broke down, or I shouldn't say broke down, it only broke once in something that I wasn't responsible for. So there were a couple of costs incurred on this car, but really only one, I would say, was the car's fault, and that was the changeover valve. Oh no. These cars have a fairly complicated vacuum system that controls a lot of things, one of which is the Porsche Sport exhaust. So you want to hit the loud mode and turn on the louder exhaust in the car, there's a valve for that. And on my car, it went out. Now, this doesn't affect the drivability of the car. You can continue to drive it. In fact, this happened to me when I was on my cross-country trip, driving this from Ohio to California. So obviously no effect on the car, but you do get a light on the gauge cluster, which is super annoying. Of course, we wanted to get this fixed. Now, I got lucky because this car, by some miracle, ended up still being covered under a CPO. I'm still not quite sure how that happened, but I do have the paperwork from when the Porsche dealer fixed this issue. And it would have set me back $1,500 for them to change one changeover valve on this car. It does involve, taking off all this crap and getting to the engine bay. It's not a super involved job, but it is involved enough that it was, basically $1,500 in labor. The changeover valve itself is quite cheap. So that was the first thing and only thing, in fact, that broke with this car. Now, when I talked about other costs incurred, when I purchased the car, it actually had a bent wheel already. And when I drove it initially, it had just the slightest shake in the steering wheel. I kind of lived with it for a while, but did decide to eventually replace it because it just bothered me. I needed the car to be absolutely perfect, because otherwise it was. Now, I could have just tried to purchase a used wheel, but I was worried that I was going to run into the same issue, that I would potentially stumble across another wheel that is also bent, and then, basically be at square one. So I decided to purchase a OEM Porsche GT4 wheel. The problem with that is the cost. $1,500. This was after going to my friends at suncoastparts.com, check them out. I went to them and they had the best price that I could find for a front wheel for this car. And I just had to eat that cost. I didn't want to risk a used wheel, and I had to have a perfectly non-vibrating steering wheel at speed. And that's one of the things I wanted to mention when it comes to kind of hidden costs when it comes to GT cars, because it's not just that parts are expensive, like 2 to 3 times a normal cost of a part. You would expect like a OEM wheel from a regular car to be like what, $200 or $300. I mean, this is like 5 times that. It's insane. So I'm actually quite lucky because the rear wheels on this car are $2,000 a piece. So fortunately, I guess in some ways, it was just the front one that ended up being replaced for $1,500. So, round about $3,000 in at this point. The car, during my ownership, I had it for the 36,000 mile service, so I had to do that. I got a quote from the dealership for the 36,000 mile service, another $2,200. That was to basically replace all the air filters, intake air filters, cabin filters, pollen filters, and then also to do the spark plugs and an oil change. I got that quote and I about fell out of my chair. So because of this whole fiasco of $2,200 for service, I decided to do it myself. Well, at least most of it. So you may have seen on the previous videos, I did the spark plugs on this car. I covered a bunch of this stuff in previous videos, so go back and check it out. The only thing that I left up to a independent mechanic, because the dealership wanted $400 or $500 just to change the oil alone, was the oil change. So $200 for an oil change from an indie shop. And the only reason that I did that is because this car, I could change the oil myself, it's no big deal, but I don't have the computer to reset the service light. So I would have gone through all that process of changing the oil and then had to go somewhere like the dealership anyways to have them reset the light. It's super annoying. I hate that they do this on all these expensive cars. Like, you have to go to the dealership for that kind of stuff. Super annoying. So $200 to have an indie shop do the oil change, which is a lot, but not a lot for these cars. And then another $100 in spark plugs alone. And then roughly another $100 for the rest of the filters and stuff like that. So you're looking at about $400 if you want to do most of that 36,000 mile oil change or service yourself. And, you know, that's the big thing when it comes to Porsches and GT cars, of course, more specifically, is that if you're willing to do the work yourself, I mean, by me doing it myself, I basically saved $2,000. So if you're willing to do the work yourself, the cost of ownership is significantly less. If you have to take it to the dealership for everything, just know that you're gonna pay top dollar for that kind of thing. Okay, this is the part of the video where my microphone got jacked up, but just to sum this all up, the car ended up costing me about $3,400 to own for about a year. And obviously, once again, $1,500 of that was a bent wheel, which you can't really blame the car for. So, you know, give or take right around $2,000 in maintenance and fixing of the car to own it for a year. And last but certainly not least, you need to take into account what you bought the car for versus what you sold the car for. Now, this one's a bit of a weird one because the market is so crazy right now, especially for sports cars. There's really no such thing as a depreciating car right now in the sports car space. So yeah, of course I didn't lose any money on this car. And I'm not really going to get into exactly what I sold it for, but you can definitely look up my ad on Renlist, which is a Porsche forum, and I would recommend if you sell or buy Porsches to go there. It's a great place for enthusiasts, but you can look up what I listed it for there, and knowing already that I paid 55 grand for the car originally. Now we get to the saddest part of the video. The final drive in my GT4. A lot of people have a tough time understanding how I can say this is the best car I've ever owned and I'm selling it. People will always ask me, like, okay, if this is the best car you've ever owned, like, why would you ever consider getting rid of it? And the answer to that is that despite this being the best car that I've personally experienced, I value the next experience more than I value the best experience I've had so far. So what do I mean by that? I just want to try always the next thing that's out there in the car world, whether it's in the same, you know, vein as this with another Porsche, or it's going to be something completely different. I just like variety, and I like experiencing as many of the iconic sports cars as possible. If you've followed my channel at all, I've tried to own all the cool ones, like all the classic ones, E46 M3, E90 M3, STIs, Evos, you know, Mustang, GT350, Porsche 911s. Like, I've been all over the map, and that's what keeps me going. As much as I really like to drive this car, and it does pain me to get rid of because I think it is a unique vehicle, especially for the price. I couldn't get into a clean title GT4, it's too expensive. So I got to experience the entire Porsche GT4 experience for a lot less money, and that's why I took this opportunity. And I've had my fun, and it's time for someone else to have their fun with this car. As much as I would like to hold on to it, it's time for the next thing. So I'm super excited for the next owner, because What's interesting about him is he's a subscriber, and he also owned a 997 Carrera S just like I did before this. So he's going to have a similar perspective, and I know he's going to enjoy it just as much as I did. We've talked about why I'm selling it, and we've talked about why it's going. But the last thing that I'll talk about is what it's like to own a GT4. And there's a couple things I want to touch on. I haven't been able to take it to the track, which is my biggest regret. If you ever get a GT4, definitely take it to the racetrack. It's made for that, obviously. The GT cars are made for that. That said, I did have the opportunity to drive it on a bunch of different canyon roads out here. I've driven it in twisty roads in Ohio. I've driven it all across the US, like in the road trip across here. So I have a pretty good experience with this car. And the fun factor is incredible. The sound that this car makes, that's one of the things that whenever people would drive in this with me, when I would give them a ride, they always talked about how good it sounds. That flat six is it just sings. And a lot of the newer Caymans and Boxsters have the 4 cylinders, which are turbocharged, which make more power and are faster, but this engine just has more character. It loves to rev. It revs to 8,000 RPM, which is something I really enjoyed about my Mustang GT350. But what I didn't enjoy about that GT350 was the size. And that brings me to my next point. After the sound, the size of this car is just perfect. And the balance, of course, being that it's mid-engine, it's just so good. A 911 will give you a rear engine experience, and that is fun in its own way. It's unique in its own way. But this car, the way it just rotates around you, I love it. And I'm very, very sad to see it go. It is a bummer. But like I said, the next owner is going to have a great experience. The only thing I would change with this car is not the gearing. I know people talk about the gearing's too long. Sure, like it could be a little bit shorter, but it's definitely not a deal breaker by any means. Some people say, hey, it could have more power. I really do. It's fine. Like it's plenty quick. It's none of those things. The only thing I would change with this car is I wish it had nose lift. Nose lift is a feature on 991 GT3s and newer GT3s that it's aptly named, it raises the nose of the car so you can get in and out of, areas of, frankly, the city where I've been driving it a lot that would normally scrape. And that's a problem I have with this car. It's so low, it doesn't have nose lift. Driving it around LA where there are just crazy embankments, crazy drainage ditches, I wish it had nose lift. It would make for a much more enjoyable experience to live with. Outside of that, you can absolutely drive this car every day. The suspension is firm, but not punishing. These interiors are a lot nicer than the older generation, like my 997. The 0.1 generation wasn't so good. You can drive these modern, dare I call it a supercar, every day, and it's not an issue. So thank you so much to everyone who has subscribed throughout this content. I've thoroughly enjoyed owning this car, and it's on to the next person. Let me know what you think in the comments below as to what I should purchase next. I have a couple ideas, but who knows? We'll see. And as always, I appreciate you guys watching. I will see you on the next episode.